Hey world, check me out. It's Collection Connection, the game that's just an excuse to talk about records. I play the game with my brother, Plastic Eric, and he plays his half of the game on his own channel, the Plastic Soundwave Cult. Each and every Monday, I think it's been over 2.5 years since we've missed one, Eric will present an album from his music collection that relates to the album I showed in my previous episode. And every Thursday, I find a new connection to his album via a different album in my collection, and back and forth we go. But maddeningly, we don't tell you the facet or quirk that these seemingly unrelated albums or artists have in common, because the challenge for you is to try to work it out. Last time, Eric shared Abacab, the 11th studio outing from the ever-evolving Genesis, released in 1981. Chugging along to the end of that decade, we have a band that put out their first album in 1981, but after a decade had logged enough chart smashes to release a greatest hits album celebrating their first decade as a band. From 1989, it's Duran Duran with Decade. If you think you can work out the very esoteric connection between these two albums, put your guess in the comments, where the first successful one gets a shout out in my brother's next video. But first, let's officially reveal the connection between the prior pair of albums, those being Split Enz' True Colors and Genesis's Abacab. I think that's it's Genesis's, I guess. And the connection there is that each album was released with a bunch of different color variants of the cover art. Now, Eric had very cleverly shown a different variant each time he showed the cover art for each album, and in addition to that, I caught that one, but he had to tell me that in addition to that, every time he had a cut, he changed a part of his outfit to subtly indicate the changing variants, the subtle variants of the album covers. I didn't even notice that. He had to point that out to me, but kudos to him for a great connection and a cleverly presented video on that connection. So, good stuff. Nonetheless, nobody got it. And so that point goes to us. And with that, we can get on with the show. All right then. So in Eric's last video, he talked about Abacab from Genesis. And if I'm honest, I fear for the length of this video because I have a long and complicated history with Genesis. I'm not sure how much I'll get into it here, but I guess I'll talk until I'm done talking. Before I move on to the Connection album. Abacab is a great record. It's one that I had on vinyl back in the day, in the 80s. Genesis was sort of my first band. Eric, as my older brother, was super influential on the kind of things that I would listen to and glom onto in the late 70s, early 80s, primarily Queen. And so I was a big Queen fan, but I felt like I needed a band that was sort of Eric approved, but not a band that he explicitly was a fan of. And in 1981, Phil Collins put out Face Value, which we talked about way back in our very first episode. Was the third album we ever mentioned. Back in the earliest days, we did compendium episodes where we went back and forth a few times. And so the third album ever on the Collection Connection aired in the first episode. We talked about Face Value. This is the last time we've brought up Phil Collins or Genesis since. We haven't done another of their albums, but the double-barreled hit of Face Value and Abacab turned me on to Genesis, and I really loved the title track. I was obsessed with the opening 30 seconds or so of that song, the whole intro as it kind of tightens up and gets that anticipation going and gets a little tighter and tighter until it hits into the groove. God, I listened to that. I couldn't tell you how many times. And I had a lot of Genesis. They fall into a crack of stuff that I used to own that I never bought when I made my way over to CDs exclusively. I had quite a bit of their back catalog either on cassette, like I had the self-titled Genesis album on cassette. I had the Phil Collins solo albums on cassette. But I had Duke, Abacab, as well as some older things like Trick of the Tail, Seconds Out, and even Trespass, which is sort of a story to itself. I bought it because, hey, I'm a Genesis fan. Here's a Genesis album. I picked it up, took it home, and just super hated it. I've rarely had a worse reaction to an album, to the point where I was convinced that it was not Genesis because it didn't sound anything like the Genesis that I knew. And only over time did I kind of become aware that Genesis started as a band that was fronted by Peter Gabriel, much more proggy, arty, and this was early in that run. And so, no wonder. I think it was 5 or even a 6-piece band that early on that just didn't sound anything like the Genesis that I was familiar with. And that really biased me against Gabriel era Genesis, kind of to this day. As Eric mentioned, I love solo Gabriel. I liked Phil Collins Genesis, but Peter Gabriel Genesis was just never my thing. And I know that runs against the grain. People who love Lamb Lies Down on Broadway and albums like that, they just never did it for me. I did like Trick of the Tail, and I think I had And Then There Were Three, but after I shed all of these albums from my collection, just because I got rid of all my albums, I actually gave them to Eric. I got rid of my cassettes after they had spent a couple of years up in an attic that just got hot in the summer and cold in the winter, kind of ruined them all. And I chucked all those, and then I was just solidly onto CD. And Duke, and actually quite recently, the self-titled album Genesis, are the only two that I have bought on CD. So Abacab, as familiar as I was with it, and as much as I had listened to it in my youth as an album I haven't really listened to for decades now, so it was really fun to cue it up and enjoy. No Reply at All was a great song. Man on the Corner. And I think I even appreciated songs like Dodo/Lurker more now than I would have back then. I will back up that Whodunit is kind of an irritating song. Eric mentioned that as I was listening to it, it was annoying me a little bit, but what I really heard, in my whatever the ear version of Mind's Eye, my mind's ear, what I heard was this song playing and my wife, like in the car, and my wife in the passenger seat saying, "Oh my God, can we please turn on something else?" as they do the "we know, we know, we all know, yeah, we all know, yeah, we all know, we know, we all know, we know." Doing that over and over again would drive her out of her mind, which made me laugh. I could sit through it, but I could definitely feel it wearing thin on me. But other than that, and not really having a sense of the last couple of songs, they had fallen out of my head entirely in the intervening years. It was a good listen. It was fun to cue it up, and would be a solid addition to my collection if I still really listen to Genesis actively, which I don't. I followed them through the one after Genesis, the one with Invisible Touch, and I'm drawing a blank on what it's called right this second. It wasn't called Invisible Touch, was it? I even bought the We Can't Dance album. I felt like I was done. It took me a little longer to reach that Phil Collins saturation point that most people seem to reach right around this 1985-1986 corridor, where No Jacket Required and the album that I can't think of its name were sort of ubiquitous and all over the place, and he had spent a good number of years kind of being ubiquitous. And it wasn't really until the But Seriously album with like Groovy Kind of Love and Another Day in Paradise that I kind of decided, yeah, you know what, I think I've had my fill of Phil Collins as well. Initially had no intention to buy We Can't Dance, but I kind of liked the song No Son of Mine, and so I grudgingly bought it, but I didn't like that album at all, and ended up that being a rare discard, that I sold back. It's very rare for me to do that, but I did do that with that album. Nonetheless, Abacab was great stuff. It did also produce the 3x3 EP, which he mentioned, which included the song Paper Late, which is a favorite of mine. I love Paper Late, very much in that Phil Collins mode at the style, using those Earth, Wind, and Fire horns, the Phoenix horns. Super poppy, great chorus. That was really the kind of Genesis that I jammed to, and would love to have Paper Late. Like if Paper Late was on Abacab, I would probably own Abacab in my collection right now. But it isn't, and I don't. And so I'm not a huge fan of live albums. I mentioned I had Seconds out, never listened to it. Didn't want to get Three Sides Live, which I believe eventually got Paper Late stuck on it on that fourth side of studio tracks. But weirdly, I'm realizing possibly a thing, but it's not a thing. The fact that Duran Duran had Wild Boys, which was appended onto a live album, and kind of in this time period, Genesis had the 3x3 EP, which had Paper Late, and those songs were appended onto a live album. But it doesn't super work, and it's not the connection, so don't get confused by that. But wrapping up this part of it, Abacab, solid album. Definitely from the corridor of my favorite era of Genesis, the Phil Collins-led Genesis. Uncool, but good songs. I guess we'll revisit that theme here in a second. And yeah, so let's move on to the connection, which is Decade from Duran Duran. Their greatest hits from 1989, which took songs from their first 5 albums. Their first 3 albums were the ones where they took over the world, basically. They started out, We Were in England for Planet Earth, which was their very first single. It was a hit right away. They were big right away in England. They had the style. They kind of became the vanguard for the New Romantic style. I think they were the first ones to even use that phrase in their lyrics, the New Romantic. And it's funny, I liked Planet Earth as a single kind of from the get-go. But as I've mentioned before, during that time period, I was more listening to Quiet Riot and Queen and bands that rocked a little more. And if I was a music snob, and this is when I'm like 9 years old, it was a defensiveness about, is it rock enough? Is it cool enough? It's not very cool if it doesn't rock. And of course, Duran Duran, their primary audience in those early years was female, particularly teenage female. And we seem to have an obsession with putting down the music that appeals to teenage girls. And I think I probably shared in some of that just as a chip on my shoulder, whatever. Like these pretty boys in their silly outfits, whatever. And so they weren't a band that I took seriously. And then later on, as I became the kind of person who listened to, Peter Gabriel and REM and alternative music and college music and The Cure and the Smiths and things of that nature, my snobbishness then kind of evolved into things maybe just being a little too popular and sort of having just a grudge for no reason about bands that were just too popular. And all that led to kind of just a disinterest in Duran Duran. Not because the songs weren't good, just because the cool factor wasn't there for me. I didn't want to listen to the music that teenage girls listened to. And later on in the later 80s, I didn't really want to listen to bands that were at the top of the charts. Nonetheless, by 1989, when they did put out a best of, taking songs from those first 5 albums, I had liked enough of their recent stuff, especially Skin Trade off of Notorious, that I'm like, shoot, it's got Planet Earth. It's a way to get all of those one-off hits, I'm assuming, that were, kind of okay to my ear. And then that can be all the Duran Duran that I need. But the funny thing about it is that they're great songs. Getting away from my own sort of prejudices and the uber popularity of Duran Duran in the early 80s, coming back to the States where they had already lost relevance and would end up scoring a couple more hits in the early 90s with She's Come Undone and Ordinary World. They were sort of already on the fade fairly quickly. They were more flash in the pans in the US. Their first album was not released here in 1981. Rio was, and then when they put out the non-album single, Is There Something I Should Know, they stuck that into the running order of the first album and then released it in the US. So there's weirdly a 1983 song on their 1981 debut on the US lineup. And all of that seemed to come to a head around the world with Seven and the Ragged Tiger, their third album, which ironically I find kind of the weakest stuff. It's the first time it starts to feel like a self-parody, because I have since gone, in the last 10 or so years, I have bought the first album, the self-titled Duran Duran, and Rio. I think I bought them both probably at Barnes & Noble when I saw them for like $4.99, and I'm like, shoot, that's worth it. And Rio in particular, really strong album. Even the non-hits, it's a good listen from beginning to end. And it's been rewarding to get to know the deeper cuts and to really familiarize myself with that away from the hype and the style and what felt like style over substance at the time, maybe unfairly, and when really they're just some kick-ass songs. And it's not until like Union of the Snake and especially Wild Boys wears very thin on me, and it seems like it's kind of out of Simon Le Bon's range. Even when he was singing it back then, I can't imagine that they would perform it now because it's just so high. It's kind of awful to listen to. But Union of the Snake sort of feels like a self-conscious parody of Hungry Like the Wolf, and The Reflex was okay, but their commercial peak, which was their third album, Seven and the Ragged Tiger, even the album title makes me cringe a little bit. Makes me feel like those later songs. So after that third album and the live album Arena, that's when they kind of split, went their separate ways. For a time, some of them formed the Power Station with Robert Plant, and the remaining three formed Arcadia. They each put out some stuff. They were off doing their own things, scored hits as those side projects, and then came back together for the Bond theme, A View to a Kill, which I feel like was kind of a return to form for them. It still had those kind of orchestra hit sounds, but was a pretty good song. And then for their next album, where they were just a trio now of Simon Le Bon, Nick Rhodes, and I think John Taylor. There's three guys named Taylor, none of whom are related. I know there's Roger Taylor on drums, and there's Andy Taylor and John Taylor, and I can never remember which one is which with Andy and John Taylor. I know that one of them had some single success in the late 80s doing a song from like the 9.5 Weeks or something soundtrack, something like that. Never anything all that big. But the Notorious album, they were down to a trio. They got together with Nile Rodgers and put together an album there, and both Skin Trade and the title track, Notorious, I thought were pretty good songs. Even though their cultural relevance had faded somewhat, and looking at AllMusic, their review going kind of through their catalog, they start to feel like this is a low point, and the following album, Big Thing, which was the last one that their songs included from on Decade, they have as a complete failure. But I like the singles from that. All She Wants Is, maybe not the best, but I like it better than the Seven and the Ragged Tiger tracks. And I Don't Want Your Love is a jam. It's a great song. I love it. So even though I'm not familiar with those albums, those studio albums, I would be willing to give them a go. Reading the user reviews on Big Thing, especially on AllMusic, most of those people say, hey man, it was more experimental. A lot of those think it's their strongest album, Big Thing. So even though I don't know the deep cuts and I wasn't interested at the time in learning of the deep cuts, this weird 2010s sort of resuscitation of Duran Duran for me personally has been interesting, and I appreciate them maybe more now than I ever did in the 80s. So that's, to me, is interesting. Maybe not to you. I feel like I've been talking for a while. I don't know if I've missed any points that I meant to hit. So I will say that as a connection, the connection is down to the two albums, Abacab and Decade, but requires no knowledge of either album to figure out what the connection is. In fact, I would say just the related discipline, if you know a little music theory, that might help identify the connection between the two albums, but it is specific to these two albums. And if you have a guess, you can leave that down in the comments, and we would appreciate it. So it's definitely a little diabolical, but I think you can get it if you just think on it a little bit. More just trivia that's in your head that you can apply to both of these albums. And with that, I will throw Decade, the greatest hits of the first decade of Duran Duran from 1989, over to Eric, where he will find a connection from his music collection and talk about that on Monday. And with that, that's all I have, so I thank you for watching. Bye-bye. Good show, Ponsonby.